Hello students, we have discussed 10 chapters of poetics. In chapter 10, we have discussed kinds of plots that are simple and complex, and we have seen that in a complex plot there is an abrupt change of direction. The hero's fortune rise up to a certain point, the climax, and then fall rapidly downwards. So there are reversals, peripetia, and recognitions or discoveries, anagnorisis. These terms we have discussed in chapter 10th, and now we will start chapter 11th. In chapter 11th, we will see that peripety, anagnorisis, and suffering are three formative elements of the plot of a tragedy. And in a complex plot, there is a climax or turning point. We have seen this thing in chapter 10. In a complex plot, there is a climax or turning point at which some sort of discovery leads directly to the change of fortune. So, what is the turning point concerned with? Turning point directly concerned with change of fortune, and this change of fortune Aristotle calls the peripety, a sudden reversal of fortune's wheel. So there is a sudden change in the sequence of incidents. The most effective form of peripety is one that is exactly coincident with anagnorisis, that is the discovery of some fact, as in the Oedipus Tyrannus. We can see some examples of this peripety in Oedipus Tyrannus, where Oedipus' fortune is reversed at the point where he discovers his parentage. And peripety can also be interpreted to mean the reversal of the agent's intention, that is, a situation in which the consequence of the hero's action is the opposite of what he intended. And this Bumray's device is certainly effective and full of tragic irony. When a hero finds something different from what he intended, then he finds himself in ironical situations, and it is present in the peripety of the Oedipus. And in Duncan's Murder in Macbeth, we also can find this example of peripety, because the results in this plot were not what Macbeth intended. In this sense, peripety can be defined as a kind of tragic irony, forming the very basis of the plot. So, two parts of the plot, then peripety and discovery, are on the matters of this sort. Third part is suffering, and third part, that is suffering, may be defined as an action of a destructive or painful nature, such as murders on the stage, tortures, mimicry, wounding, etc. So these acts are called as the suffering. This part of tragedy is called as suffering. Now we will see chapter 12. Chapter 12 deals with quantitative parts of tragedy. Till now we have seen formative parts of tragedy. Now we will see the quantitative parts of tragedy. The parts of tragedy to be treated as formative elements in the whole were mentioned in a previous chapter from the point of view, however, of its quantity. That is, the separate sections into which it is divided. A tragedy has the following parts. So the quantitative sections of tragedy are matters of Greek theatrical convention. Just as it is conventional to divide modern dramas into acts and scenes. Scholars have generally regarded the chapter as interpolation because it has the little originality and is not connected in any way with the main theme of the poetics. Rather, it comes in the way of the smooth flow of thought from chapter 11 to chapter 13. So, the quantitative sections of the tragedy listed by Aristotle are can dis- can be dis- sorry are discussed as follows: prologue, episode, excerpt, choric song. Further, choric song is divided into parod, stasimon, and comos. And fourth, the comos is a joint lamentation of the chorus and the actors. Prologue Prologue is the entire part which precedes the parod of the chorus. The parod is the entrance song of the chorus, and episode is that entire part of a tragedy which is between complete choric songs. Episode is the equivalent of an act in our drama. The stasimon is a choric ode, and the chomos is a joint lamentation of the chorus and the actors together. And sixth one, that is exode. Exode is the entire part of the tragedy after the last song of the chorus. Now, in chapter 13, we will see the structure of a perfect tragedy and what is an ideal tragic hero. So, in this chapter, Aristotle defines an ideal tragic hero, and at the same time, he also presents a structure of a perfect tragedy. In the very beginning of the chapter, Aristotle expresses his preference for complex plots, which he has already defined in chapter 11. In his view, the distinctive tragic emotions are pity and fear, and so the plot must be such as likely to arouse these emotions. It follows from this that three kinds of plots are to be avoided. So, what are the things or qualities of a character that should be avoided? A perfectly good man must not be shown passing from happiness to misery, for such an action will be disgusting and odious. So, presentation of a hero should not be disgusting and odious. It will not arise the emotions of pity and fear. Second thing, a bad man passing from misery to happiness is also not suitable for tragedy. Obviously, such a situation is not at all tragic, and an extremely bad man falling from happiness into misery is equally unfit. His fate is well deserved, and pity and fear are aroused by the undeserved suffering of one like us. An extremely bad man is not like us, for human nature is a mingled yarn of good and bad. So, having ruled out utter villains and men preeminently just and good as heroes proper to tragedy, Aristotle proceeds to lay down the qualification of an ideal hero. In the first place, he must be a person of an intermediate kind, neither an utter villain nor a man perfectly good and just. So he should be an intermediate kind. On the whole, he should be a good man, but with ordinary human weaknesses and frailties. So the person that who is the subject for tragedy should have ordinary human weaknesses and frailties. In this way, he should be like us, and our pity and fear would be aroused by his misfortunes. His misfortunes must not be wholly undeserved. They must result from his own actions. It means he should have a tragic flow, and that is termed as amarsia. Aristotle gives the term amarsia for the tragic flow, and this word has given rise to much hair splitting among scholars. The consensus or opinion is that it means an error of judgment or miscalculation rather than any moral weakness or depravity. Secondly, the ideal tragic hero must be a person who enjoys prosperity, name, and fame. It means he must be a noble rank, he must be of a noble rank in society. He must be a person highly placed in society, for the fall of such a person is more likely to excite the tragic emotions than the fall of a person not so eminently placed. If a an ordinary man falls in tragic situations, then the emotions of fear and pity are not aroused as well. He must belong to some great family, as was the convention of the Greek tragedy. Now, chapter 14 deals with the comparative study of spectacle and the plot as source of tragic emotions. When a tragedy is performed on the stage, tragic emotions are aroused. But what are the sources for this, for the arising of these emotions? According to Aristotle, spectacle and plot are the sources, but which is the more effective for arising these emotions? And this thing is studied in this chapter 14. Pity and fear may be aroused by the mere sight of a disaster, what Aristotle calls the spectacle. Example, Oedipus, with his eyes torn out, but the true proper pleasure of tragedy is independent of spectacle and is felt even when the play is read without performance. It means spectacle is not necessary to arouse tragic emotions because it is produced by the structure and sequence of the incidents. The most effective situation, Aristotle concludes, is where one member of a family murders or does irreparable harm to another member. This may be done in ignorance and the kinship we discovered afterwards. More effective still is it if the kinship is discovered just in time to avert the doing of the deed. This rather inconsistently allows the fullest tragic effect to play with a happy ending, which theorists of modern tragedy would not admit. But the conditions of the Greek stage could not provide a quick curtain. The characters and the chorus had to achieve their exit with dignity and beauty. This necessitated some relaxation of tension after the act of murder or other disaster, and for that reason, a happy ending of this sort was more appropriate than it would be on the modern stage. We may also note as evidence in support of Aristotle then that a sudden escape at the 11th hour serves powerfully to stimulate the relief of tears. And the arising of tragic emotions is called tragic pleasure. The tragic pleasure is that of pity and fear, and the poet has to produce it by a work of imitation. It is clear, therefore, that the causes of tragic emotions should be included in the events of his story. In an action of this description, the parties must necessarily be either friends or enemies or indifferent to one another. Now, when an enemy kills an enemy, there is nothing to move us to pity either in his action or in his meditating the deed, except so far as the actual pain of the sufferer is concerned. And the same is true when the parties are indifferent to one another. Whenever the tragic deed, however, is done within the family, when murder or the like is done or meditated by brother or on brother, by son on father, by mother on son, or son on mother, These are the situations the poet should seek after. And these situations can arouse pity and fear, tragic emotions. A third possibility is for one meditating some deadly injury to another in ignorance of his relationship to make the discovery in time and to draw back. These exhaust the possibility since the deed must necessarily be either done or not done, and either knowingly or unknowingly. So these are the factors that affect the arousal of tragic emotions. The worst situation is when the person is with full knowledge on the point of doing the deed and leaves it undone. It is odious also through the absence of suffering and tragic. Hence, it is that no one is made to act thus except in some few instances. Example: Haman and Creon in Antigone. Next, after this comes the actual perpetration of the deed meditated. A better situation than that, however, is for the deed to be done in ignorance and the relationship discovered afterwards, since there is nothing odious in it, and the discovery will serve to startle us. In chapter 15, Aristotle deals with characters. This chapter deals with characterization in a tragedy. Aristotle lists four essentials of successful characterization. So, what are the points that should be kept in mind by the tragedy writer? First, the character must be good. A character is good if his words and actions reveal that his purpose is good. In ancient Greece, women were considered as inferior beings and slaves as worthless. But Aristotle says that when introduced in a tragedy, even women and slaves must be shown to have some good in them. So, good is essential for the characterization. Entirely wicked characters, even when assigned minor roles, are unfit for tragedy. Wickedness or depravity is to be introduced only when absolutely necessary for the plot. Aristotle is against wanton introduction of wickedness. Just as a successful painter makes his portrait more beautiful than the original and still retains the likeness to the original, in the same way, the poet must represent his characters better and more dignified and must still preserve the likeness to the original. Second thing, the characters must be appropriate. That is to say, they must be true to types and or status. For example, a woman must be shown as womanly and not manly. A slave must be given a character which is appropriate to his status. Manliness would not be appropriate in a woman and dignity and nobility in a slave. So the status and type should be kept in mind of the character. Woman should be given womanly status and slaves should be given a status of slave. If the characters are taken from some known myth or story, say the story of